A discussion about accounting and reporting cannot be complete without visiting the role of ethics in business. Accounting reports carry messages to stakeholders throughout our community, and so it's important that we be able to have confidence in those reports and in the way that they're prepared. Quite apart from any ethical or moral position, it is a fact that corporate failures impose very high costs on our community. It's important to implement standards and requirements that limit this loss, and we do know that some business failures could have been made less traumatic had codes and practices of ethics been stronger. However, corporate failure is in the first instance caused by poor business models and poor management, so we can never completely avoid all corporate failure. Ethics has to do with humans and human behaviour standards. If pressed, most of us would list characteristics of an ethical person and include many of the points below. The inescapable point here is that we're dealing with humans and human weaknesses. So what causes humans to engage in unethical behaviour? Here's a list. We probably all know people who sometimes are guilty of some of these behaviours. Our role in business is to be aware that the potential for these things to happen and to try to put in place procedures and safety nets to avoid them. So let's ask some questions of ourselves at this point. What is good behaviour for business? And is it different from good behaviour for individuals and society? Now, I'm not going to dare to answer those questions here, but these are all good questions that each one of us needs to think about. Another question to ponder is if the profit motive coincides with ethical behaviour. And if your answer to yourself on that question is no, you probably should do some soul searching about why you feel that way. There are a number of ethical theories that provide lots of scope for discussion. Here are two: Utilitarianism and Deontology. So, what is good behaviour? And is it the same thing as good behaviour in business and for individuals and for society? Another question to ponder is if the profit motive coincides with ethical behaviours. If your answer is no to that question, you probably should do some deep soul searching about why you feel that way. I'm not going to presume to give any answers to these questions, but they are good questions, and each one of us in business needs to think about them quite deeply. There are two frameworks there are many frameworks, in fact, many theories, but here are two which help us to think of these decisions in quite different ways. Utilitarianism talks about the consequences of our actions. In other words, it's the good or the bad which defines whether an action is a good or a bad action. So the moral correctness of whatever the end results are justifies the decision you made at the beginning. And ideally, under that sort of scenario, the more stakeholders that are the better off, the more moral was your decision. Another theory which many of us ponder is called deontology. Deontology focuses on the actions rather than the outcomes. And it starts from the point of asking about each action that we have to consider is whether that action is itself morally responsible. This brings us to the point where they argue, can say that some decisions are right and some decisions are wrong, and that's regardless of what the outcomes might be. So those who subscribe to deontology would argue that doing the right thing is the right thing because it's the right thing. And other people look at both the action and the outcome. In the business world, we can observe that many professional bodies actually establish codes of conduct. And the point of having these codes of conduct is to make sure that the more egregious or unethical behaviours would be contrary to the membership of that particular professional body. And we can ask ourselves whether in fact having a code of conduct is the same as being ethical. Again, this is a good debate. I suppose the basic point here would be that we would hope that in having a code of conduct, what we are doing is underpinning a definition of what sorts of behaviours are okay and what sorts of behaviours are not. We can also see that many businesses these days, as part of their governance, establish codes of behaviour or values, and they actively pursue those within their employees and their management bodies. Some businesses deliberately set out to develop reputations of being ethical, and in such a case, those businesses would be said to be subscribing to the theory of deontology. Deontology. In other words, what they do is right, and that's why they do it, because it's right. There's another point to ponder here, and it's the bottom point here, that sometimes by following a code, it doesn't necessarily lead to ethical outcomes. Remember that the focus on outcomes is the utilitarianism theory, and in that theory, a decision is an ethical one if the outcomes are good. So what they're highlighting here is that sometimes we can make a decision based on believing it is the right decision, and perhaps the outcomes may be less than totally desirable. A fine example in our business literature is that of HOH Insurance, where a Royal Commission following that collapse stated that HOH management used and relied on questionable transactions. Questionable is their word. Questionable transactions, which in turn gave rise to doubtful accounting entries, which disguised the seriousness of the situation. Now, a very important and somewhat perplexing point for us to consider is that these doubtful transactions, so-called, were acceptable according to existing standards at that time. Of course, what we do know is that the HIH failure and others that were happening around the same time, which was around the early 2000s, gave rise to a wave of corporate governance requirements dealing with ethical behaviour and ethical standards. There is a code of conduct for accountants, and if you're interested, you can find that at that URL there. This code is adopted by the major accounting professional bodies, and it does provide guidance when there are ethical accounting dilemmas. Members of the accounting profession also have access to free advice from their accounting organisations if they come up against what they believe to be an ethical dilemma and they're unsure of which way to deal with it. And so in summary, we see that ethics is talking about a moral approach both to actions and to outcomes. We in the community have an expectation that businesses will behave ethically. But the difficulty, of course, is that everybody's idea of ethics is not necessarily the same. And the arguments still rage in our community about whether there is a trade-off between ethical behaviour and the profit motive. Would such a trade-off be consistent with a sustainable business? So here we take the argument or the discussion a little further, and perhaps we're here starting to discuss what's loosely known as the societal license to operate. If society decides that a business has been behaving unethically, it's very probable that on a broad front, society, groups of people, will refuse to deal with that business. And so there's almost a self-correcting mechanism in place. But sadly, there's often a lot of damage done before we get to that point. We talked about two different approaches to assess ethics, one of which was based on assessing the outcomes, that's the utilitarian approach, and the other of which starts with the actions, which these people argue can be right or wrong by definition, and that definition is independent of the outcomes. That is the deontological approach.